Welcome to Bald Guy DIY. In this video, I'm going to answer the question, how do you tell if it's worth it for you to invest in solar technology for your home? So when we think about whether or not upgrading to solar technology to power our home is worth it, I'm really going to step outside of the environmental concerns and whether or not it's green for a while and focus just on the concept of, is it economically feasible? Now, of course, this is going to vary greatly depending on where you are in the world. Even where you are within the same country can vary quite a bit from state to state, or in my case, province to province. So I'm just simply going to lay out the factors for you today of what goes into a decision about whether or not solar is worth it, so you understand what to focus on and how to sift through all of the promises of short-term payback and free energy. My first suggestion when you're trying to evaluate solar technology for your own home is before you get any quotes from contractors of what the equipment would cost or what installation would cost or any of those things, when the payback is, the first thing you need to know is the rules and how much power you can actually generate. Now you can contact your regulator or your utility company, or you can even find online the answer for your state or province, which details what the parameters are for producing solar energy. In Alberta, Canada, where I live, the type of solar energy that a consumer would produce in their home is called a microproducer. And really, there's a lot of rules that go into what a microproducer is. The most important rule for my area is that you're not allowed to produce more electricity than you actually consume in a year. So the time of day that solar produces is going to be different sometimes than your actual need or demand for the electricity. And so you're allowed to produce electricity that supplies the grid, but in the long term, you're not able to produce more electricity than you use in a year. This is a really important consideration, in some cases the biggest consideration, because it limits how much electricity you can save and also what the payback will be long term, because you're capped out at a certain limit. In my case, I only use about $20 to $40 worth of actual electricity consumption charges, and that's the maximum amount that I can generate. So I have to work that into the equation that the most money that I'm going to be able to save in a year is anywhere between $250 and $500. That's a really big thing to be aware of, because all of the calculations typically just show you how much you can save and how much you can generate with a certain size solar array, but it doesn't factor in the maximum that your utility will let you produce. For example, the calculations that a solar installer might show you might say that you could pay back your system in 5 years or 7 years, and that system might cost $10 or $15 or $20,000. But if the most that you could possibly generate is $500 worth, then even a $10,000 system is going to take you 20 years to pay off. In my area where I live, that's the biggest factor that makes solar not worth it for me, is that I'm limited in how much I can produce and in how much I can really save. If I look at my power bill, I'm actually paying very little for the consumption of the electricity, and most of the fees are for transmission and delivery and other administrative costs, not for the electricity itself. So it might look like I could save over $100 a month on my electrical bill, but I'm limited to only being able to produce the amount that I actually consume. I hope that you can narrow that down in your own jurisdiction, because if that's the case for you, it probably means solar is not viable. One of the next biggest factors is the place that you live. Now, depending on where you live in the world, there's a vast difference in how much available sunlight there is in order to produce solar power. Now, you might think that almost every place on Earth gets the same amount of sunlight or daylight hours in a year, and that's true, but the quality of that sunlight is varying greatly, especially when it comes to producing power with solar panels. One of the best ways that you can get a glimpse of this is to Google solar map and then your region, in my case Canada, and you can really get a good graphical representation of what areas are best for solar and which ones are worst. You might not think the differences are that substantial, but if you look at the legend and see that that's how many kilowatt hours can be produced for every kilowatt of solar panels that you have, you will find that the best places might get 1,300 kilowatt hours per kilowatt of solar panels, where the next place might only get 900. That's a huge difference. That's more than a third of the power production loss just because of the environment that you live in and what quality of sunlight you're getting. That's a huge factor when you go into how much will be paid back over time, because the person in the sunniest, best quality light might find it to be feasible financially, and for another person in a low producing area, it might just not be worth it. Definitely check that out. Get an idea of how many kilowatt hours you could really expect to generate just by Googling it for your area and see what the results come up with. The third most important factor when you're considering a solar panel installation is how much that produced electricity is going to be sold for. Now, this is also going to vary drastically depending on the region and the politics involved, and so you really need to evaluate that as part of the equation of whether or not it's going to be worth it to invest in solar technology. What do I mean by this? Well, you pay a certain amount per kilowatt hour for electricity consumption in your area. For me, I'm on a floating rate, so I might pay several different rates within a month, depending on the time of the month or even time of the day when consumption is high or low. Now, that rate isn't necessarily what I'm going to get paid for the electricity that I produce. So it's important to check out that with your local jurisdiction and find out what rate you're going to be given. You might only get the lowest rate possible, in which case, even for the electricity you produce, you might be getting less credit than what you're paying for it. In other jurisdictions, they're really pushing solar, and so I've seen them be willing to credit you a much higher amount per kilowatt hour than you would actually be paying to consume electricity from the grid. In this case, it might be definitely worth it to invest in solar, and the payback might be much shorter. It's very important to find out what rate you're going to be paid for the electricity that you produce when you're factoring in your equation of if it's worth it. So when you understand how much electricity you're allowed to produce, how many kilowatt hours, how much electricity is likely to be produced because of the area that you live in and the type of sunlight that you get, and then finally what rate you're going to be paid for that electricity, now you can determine if it's worth it. The last stage is to get those quotes from contractors, how much it's going to cost for a solar installation, and now that you know the cost, you can compare it to the value of what you're going to produce and make an educated decision of how long it's going to take to get actual payback on your solar installation. When you're getting contractor pricing, it's really important that you carefully examine how long they say it'll take to pay it back. A lot of marketing goes into determining how long payback will be, and a lot of times the promises that are made are built on false assumptions. For example, in my area, I typically only pay about 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Every solar payback calculation I've seen from local providers starts at a rate of 10 cents a kilowatt hour, which assumes that I'm already paying almost 50% more than I really am. Obviously, the payback's going to be a lot longer if my actual current rate of consumption is a lot less. If you look at the fine print, you'll also see in many cases that the contractors are assuming that there's going to be an increase in the cost of electricity over the payback cycle. And if you factor that in, you can make it look like the savings are a lot greater than they are. For example, if I'm paying 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour now, and the rate is expected to double over the next 10 or 15 years, then that would make it sound as though the payback would be much greater in those later years as the cost of electricity has climbed so much. But over the last 15 or 20 years that I've been paying utilities, I can tell you that the rate hasn't changed much at all. So assuming that it's going to double over the next 10 or 15 years would be a really sketchy assumption to make and could really skew the idea of how long it's going to take to make up the cost difference. So beware, read the fine print, and see what calculations are being made by the contractor when they promise you a quick return on your investment. As I mentioned, in my area, it's not worth it. I can only generate about $250 to $500 return per year, and it's going to cost $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 in order to get the size of capacity that would maximize my production. That's a payback of 20, 30, 40 years for the technology today. Now that might all change as technology improves and costs come down, but we're just gonna have to wait and see. I hope this helps you to make an informed decision about your own solar possibilities, and let me know if it's worth it in your area and what you use as the determining factor of whether or not it was worth it for you. I keep going back to these solar calculations every couple years because I really want it to be worth it one day, but so far it just hasn't been. If you enjoy these types of videos, please let me know in the comments, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more content, and check back every week as I post a new video. Until next time, in all your quest for knowledge, DIY projects and the like, don't be afraid to be bolder.